Well, we are real pleased and honored to be joined by the chair of the Federal Communications Commission, Ajit Pai, for this episode of Policy Gone Viral. Thank you so much for taking some time out of what I imagine has got to be a crazy schedule. First off, how are you and your family doing in this whole situation?
Well, thanks so much, Sal, for having me on and for everything that the James Madison Institute has been doing the last several weeks. From our perspective, at least, it has definitely been a transition. The FCC was one of the first, if not the first, agencies in Washington to shift to telework. And so for several weeks now, I've been here in the home office, trying to juggle the demands of the job, which continue, of course, as well as becoming an erstwhile homeschooler and making the odd run to the grocery store or the pharmacy. And so it's definitely been a transition, but thanks in part to technology, we've been able to make that transition a little smoother than it otherwise would be. So I definitely have a firsthand appreciation for some of the struggles that these millions of Americans are having right now in this new environment.
And that kind of dives right into really the first issue that we wanted to discuss with you. And that is, we now have, as a result of the pandemic, tens of millions of people working from home remotely, tens of millions of kids trying to learn from home remotely, and parents trying to sometimes do both with their kids. What are the challenges, concerns with access, and what is the FCC doing to kind of address some of those things?
Well, several weeks ago, it was clear to us that the pandemic was going to be fundamentally shifting how millions of Americans conducted their daily lives. They'd be working from home, having to educate their kids and the like. And so it followed from that we knew immediately that broadband was going to be a critical part of the pandemic response. And so we came up with what I call the Keep Americans Connected pledge, a pledge that broadband and telephone providers could take that would commit them to three basic things. Number one, to not cutting off service to any customers, small businesses or residential customers who are unable to pay their bills due to the disruptions caused by the pandemic. Number two, to waive any late fees or similar charges that those customers might incur as a result of the disruptions. And number three, to open up their Wi-Fi hotspots to anybody. And I've been gratified by the response. Now, over 650 broadband and telephone providers across the United States, covering the vast majority of American consumers, have signed up for the pledge and they're committed to doing that. And they've even met my charge to go above and beyond that, increasing speeds for free, for example, relaxing or getting rid of data caps, making sure that low-income consumers have specialized offerings just for them. And so that's one part of the equation that thankfully consumers have not had to worry about. They have many other things on mind, of course, the health aspects of the pandemic and the like, but at least broadband is one of the things that by and large they've been able to count on. And so even as we've seen an uptick in broadband usage, thanks in part to the pledge and to America's broadband providers stepping up and creating that infrastructure to allow them to connect, at least that part of it has been able to be stable, so to speak.
Well, that's great. Well, I mean, related to broadband, if we're looking at more kind of rural broadband access, what specifically, I guess, is being done kind of short and then, looking long term past the pandemic as well?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, Logan. From the beginning of my time as chairman in January 2017, I've said that closing that digital divide has to be our top priority. And now we see a key instance in which that digital divide is becoming more pronounced. And that is that many rural Americans in particular don't have access or don't have the access that they need. And that's in part why the FCC has taken essentially a two-pronged strategy. Number one, to do everything we can in the short term to address that gap. And so, for example, several weeks ago, I asked Congress to set up, among other things, a telehealth program to allow us to get rural broadband connectivity for the purpose of telemedicine and telehealth. This is a $200 million program that Congress adopted about 2 weeks ago. The president signed it. Last week, the FCC formalized the vote on that program, and we're going to be rolling that out in the very near future. But that's one way of making sure that if you're a rural American, even if you don't have coronavirus-related symptoms, we want to make sure that you are able to engage in social distancing and the like while still getting the treatment that you need. That's one example. But in the longer run, we're continuing the bread and butter work of the commission. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, for example, which is a $20 billion reverse auction fund that we set up several months ago. That auction is going to happen this summer, and it's going to provide high-speed, high-quality broadband to millions of Americans, up to 6 million households across the country. And that is a critical thing that I know won't happen next week or next month, but it's going to make sure that when the next emergency strikes, and of course we know that it will, rural Americans have the broadband that they need in order to conduct their daily lives.
Well, and access ultimately happens when the private sector kind of works with the FCC to provide it to consumers. And you've been very aggressive the last several weeks in looking at opening up spectrum and making that more available. And I saw some things even just the other day about the 6 gigahertz platform or segment of the spectrum. Can you tell, for folks who may be viewing that aren't as familiar with the concept, how that works and how it's kind of allowing the private sector to kind of step up and provide access where it's needed?
Happy to. The airwaves have become more critical than ever before. Many households are operating with multiple wireless devices under the same roof, for instance. And so as that amount of usage increases and shifts, it's no longer simply at night, for example, it's now throughout the day that people are using these devices. We need to make sure that the airwaves are optimized to meet that consumer demand. And we've done that in a couple of different ways. One is by encouraging private companies that might have spectrum assets that they're not using or are underusing to share that spectrum with other companies. And so, for example, Dish Network came to us and said, we've got certain 600 megahertz assets that we aren't using currently. We'd like to be able to share those with another company, T-Mobile, that's willing to use them and able to use them. And that requires FCC action, which we granted immediately once we got the consent of all those companies. And T-Mobile's now using those spectrum assets to deliver much stronger connectivity in New York City and other major urban areas. We've done similar things with AT&T and Verizon and US Cellular. That's just on the licensed side, so to speak, the cellular companies getting access to spectrum. But as you pointed out, Wi-Fi is increasingly important, and Wi-Fi falls under the bucket of what we at the FCC called unlicensed spectrum. That unlicensed demand has gone way up over the years, and especially during the pandemic. We need high-speed, high-quality broadband, in part to do Zoom calls such as this. And so the FCC recently announced, or I announced my plan, I'm asking the FCC to vote on April 23rd, on a bold new initiative to increase the amount of spectrum that's available for Wi-Fi by over 5 times. This is the first time in a generation the FCC will have boosted the amount of spectrum available for Wi-Fi. And this is going to promote gigabit Wi-Fi, super high-speed connections for things like AR and VR, telemedicine, gaming, and of course, things like remote learning, where you could connect with your teacher in high resolution and in real time. This is the kind of thing we need to be thinking about to meet consumer demands. And if I could just put in a plug for the overall regulatory model here, it's a very interesting study in regulatory contrast between the United States, which has been, as you said, more focusing on giving the private sector the tools they need to do the job, versus other parts of the world, for example, Europe, where they've embraced a more utility style model, where the government picks and chooses winners, directs investments, sets heavy-handed rules. Europe, for instance, has very utility-style, slow-moving regulations, like the net neutrality regulations the FCC got rid of 3 years ago. And what's the result? Well, the European Commission had to go proactively to companies like Netflix and YouTube at the inception of this pandemic and ask them to throttle, to slow down their delivery of video content, because the infrastructure simply wasn't able to handle it. And now, as a result, European consumers have the worst of both worlds. They have a very antiquated regulatory structure, and they have infrastructure that hasn't been invested in to the same level as the United States, and that isn't able to meet their needs. And so, to me at least, it's a vindication of the market-based framework that I think ultimately serves consumers very well.
Which, and I know Logan's got another question, but I wanted to segue, because you mentioned net neutrality. We just came up on an anniversary not too long ago of the repeal of those regulations. And I mean, we're seeing far greater networking speeds, far greater connectivity. It seems like a lot of the naysayers and the doomsayers were off by quite a bit. Got to be a little bit of pride on your part to have been able to kind of stick out the policy and know that you it kind of came through the right way.
Absolutely. We knew that it was the right thing to do at the time, and we've only been proven right ever since. And I think the proof is in the pudding now. Even before the pandemic, we set records for fiber deployment in 2018, a record that was only broken in 2019 with even greater fiber deployment. Millions more Americans getting access to the internet. Venture capital for online startups setting a record in 2018. The internet remaining free and open. And that was even before the pandemic, as I said. Now, during the pandemic, we've seen an uptick in usage of 20 to 35%, depending on the part of the country and the time of the day. And I think that the ability of the broadband providers to meet that need without any major disruptions that we've been able to discern is an illustration of the fact that we were right in 2017, that prioritizing infrastructure investment and high quality bandwidth was the right thing to do. Did we get a lot of heat for it? Absolutely. Was there a lot of ridiculous prediction making out there? Completely. $5 per tweet, internet's going to work one word at a time. But it's telling now that those who love that regulatory model can look to Europe as for what that would have led to. It would have led to throttling the very harms that these net neutrality advocates were trying to prevent against. And so for me, at least, I'm very gratified that the American consumer can enjoy at the end of the day better, faster, cheaper broadband than they otherwise would have been able to had we stuck with those old Obama administration regulations.
Mm-hmm.
Chairman Pai, for more information, either on specific programs during the COVID pandemic or just the FCC's broader initiatives that you all are working on, where can our viewers go?
So the first thing that they can do is go to fcc.gov, in particular, fcc.gov/keepamericans.connected. That's where we have details about the pledge and all of the other associated information that we've done along with the pledge. In addition, if you follow me on Twitter, I'm a pretty active Twitter user. I get all that information out there on social media. It's at Ajit Pai FCC, AJITPAI FCC. And conversely, if people have information they want to share with us, let us know. We want to understand what some of your concerns are. So keep in touch with us, either through Twitter or other types of media. We really want to be as responsive as we can be to the Americans out there who are struggling with this transition.
Well, Chairman Pai, we certainly appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day, running the FCC and then also working from home and being a dad and a husband to be with us on Policy Gone Viral. And we appreciate your leadership and all the work that you and your team is doing over at the FCC.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate the kind words. And likewise, having had a chance to visit with the James Madison Institute in person a few years ago, having followed you ever since, I know about the great work you're doing. Thanks for being a voice for sound policy across the state, across the country. Your voice really matters, and it's a privilege to be able to be with you today.
Well, thank you. We hope you stay safe and stay healthy, and we will talk with you soon.
Sounds great. Thanks. Oh, man.
Sal.
Yes.
That is spectacular.
I had it set, but I was like, no, I gotta go, professional.
Oh, geez. I might steal that for my next Zoom interview. That's great.
If you want, I'll send it to you somehow. Either I could email or text or something. I've got it as a JPEG.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, if you don't mind sending it over, I'd love to use it. It's a lot better than